Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Arizona Territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know what places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1881. The Arizona Territory stretched vast and unforgiving under a punishing sun, its landscape carved by centuries of wind and rain into canyons that harbored secrets best left undisturbed. It was a time of great tension as the last of the free Apache bands fought desperately against the tide of white settlement that threatened to engulf their ancestral lands. The frontier towns were rough places where fortunes could be made and lost in an instant, where the line between civilization and savagery blurred with each passing day. But even in this harsh world of uncertain morality, there existed boundaries that few dared to cross. This is the documented account of Eleanor Blackwood, a woman who arrived in the mining town of Silver Creek, some 30 miles northeast of Tucson, in the spring of 1881. What began as a curious tale of frontier eccentricity would gradually unfold into one of the most disturbing episodes in territorial history, a case that would remain buried in county archives until a chance discovery in 1957 revealed its horrifying details. The question that haunted investigators then, as it might haunt you now, remains deceptively simple. What drives a person to look upon another human being not as an equal, but as something to be possessed, consumed, and ultimately destroyed? The answer, as you will see, lies in the darkest corners of human nature, places where compassion withers and is replaced by an appetite that can never truly be satisfied. When the last Apache captives were brought to Eleanor Blackwood's doorstep, witnesses would report hearing her say 5 words that would echo through decades of whispered recollections. "Don't hurt him, I'll buy him." What happened after that purchase is a testament to how easily the facade of propriety can crack, revealing the predator that sometimes lurks behind human eyes. This is not a tale of supernatural terror, for there are no ghosts or demons to be found here, at least not in the traditional sense. The horror that unfolded in that isolated homestead was entirely of human origin, a reminder that sometimes the most frightening monsters are those that walk among us, smile in greeting, and invite us in for supper. The town of Silver Creek no longer exists. It was abandoned in 1893 when the silver mines ran dry, its buildings gradually reclaimed by the desert. But for 12 years, it was home to a woman whose actions would test the limits of what frontier justice was prepared to confront and what history was willing to remember. The evidence remains, preserved in yellowing court documents, terse military reports, and the reluctant testimonies of those who survived. This is their story. The sun was setting over the Dragoon Mountains when Eleanor Blackwood first arrived in Silver Creek. Witnesses would later recall how she sat perfectly erect in the stagecoach, her black dress unmarked by the dust of travel, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. She was, by all accounts, a striking woman of about 40, with sharp features and penetrating gray eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they fell upon. The coach driver would later tell the county sheriff that she had not spoken a single word during the 3-day journey from Tucson, save to inquire about purchasing property near the outskirts of town. Silver Creek was a town born of silver, like many others that had sprung up across the Arizona Territory since the 1870s. After the initial phases of the Apache Wars had subsided enough to make prospecting viable, miners had flocked to the region despite the continuing threat of raids. The Santa Rita Mountains, the hills around Clobe, and the area that would become Tombstone had all seen major discoveries that drew thousands of hopeful souls to the harsh landscape. Silver Creek was smaller than these better-known boom towns, but in 1881 it was still growing, its future seemingly assured by the rich veins that ran beneath the surrounding hills. Within a week, Eleanor Blackwood had acquired a small ranch house situated 2 miles from Silver Creek, a property previously owned by a prospector who had abandoned his claim after the Apache raids of 1879. The house sat in isolation at the edge of a dry wash backed by a ridge of low hills that offered protection from the wind but little else. It was not a place most women would have chosen to live alone, especially in a territory where Apache attacks, though increasingly rare, still occurred with enough frequency to keep the Army garrison at Fort Bowie on constant alert. But Eleanor Blackwood was not most women, as Silver Creek would soon discover. On her first visit to the general store, she purchased supplies typical for a new arrival: flour, coffee, sugar, salt pork, and ammunition for the Winchester rifle she carried with her. What raised eyebrows was her lengthy discussion with the storekeeper about local butchering practices and preservation methods. According to Martha Holloway, the storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Blackwood had very specific questions about the slaughtering of livestock and the salting of meat. She wanted to know how long meat would keep in the summer heat, Mrs. Holloway later recalled, and she was particular about knives, purchased the best skinning knife in the store, and asked if there were better ones available elsewhere. Struck me as odd for a lady traveling alone. The first unusual report surfaced in June of 1881, when a cavalry patrol encountered Mrs. Blackwood traveling alone, 15 miles from her property. According to Lieutenant James Wilson's report, filed at Fort Bowie on June 17th, she was found examining the site of a recent skirmish between Army scouts and a small band of Apache raiders. When questioned about her presence in such a dangerous area, she reportedly replied that she was documenting the conflict for historical purposes. The lieutenant noted her strange fascination with the signs of violence at the scene, but ultimately escorted her back to Silver Creek without incident. In his report, Lieutenant Wilson wrote, "The woman showed no fear whatsoever, despite our warnings about hostiles in the area. She seemed particularly interested in the blood patterns left on the rocks where one of the Apache had been wounded. When informed that the patrol had killed 2 warriors and wounded another, she asked if the bodies had been recovered or left where they fell." Her manner was scientific rather than ghoulish, but it was most unusual behavior for a civilian, especially a woman of her standing. By July, Eleanor Blackwood had become a topic of conversation throughout the settlement. She made weekly trips into town for supplies, but rebuffed all attempts at social interaction. She hired no servants, accepted no callers, and was frequently observed watching the hills through a brass spyglass from her front porch. Most unsettling to her neighbors was her apparent lack of fear regarding the Apache threat. While other homesteaders fortified their properties and traveled in groups, Mrs. Blackwood moved through the territory with a confidence that bordered on recklessness. It wasn't natural the way she carried herself, Martha Holloway, wife of the general store owner, told a county investigator in 1882, like she was waiting for something, like she knew something the rest of us didn't. The summer of 1881 was a particularly tense time in the Arizona Territory. The San Carlos Reservation, established in 1872 on the banks of the Gila River in eastern Arizona, had become known as Hell's 40 Acres by the Apache forced to live there. By 1881, approximately 5,000 Apache had been relocated to this barren wasteland, where the government unsuccessfully attempted to transform them into farmers. That summer, many of the Apache became followers of a medicine man named Noche del Clina, who prophesied that the old chiefs would be resurrected if the white intruders were gone by fall. This movement increased the already substantial tensions between settlers and the Apache, and the territorial newspapers frequently ran sensationalized accounts of violence on both sides. It was against this backdrop that Eleanor Blackwood's strange behavior began to take on more ominous overtones. What Martha Holloway could not have known then was just how accurate her assessment would prove to be. On August 3, 1881, the course of events that would ultimately expose Eleanor Blackwood's true nature began to unfold. A band of Apache warriors attacked a small farmstead 12 miles west of Silver Creek, killing the farmer and his oldest son. The man's wife and 3 remaining children were taken captive, a common practice during this period of the Apache Wars. Army scouts tracked the raiding party but lost their trail in the rocky terrain of the Dragoon Mountains. The Dragoons had long been a stronghold for Apache bands, particularly those led by the famous Chief Cochise until his death in 1874. The mountain's steep canyons and hidden springs made them an ideal refuge, and their proximity to Mexico provided escape routes when American forces pressed too close. For settlers in the surrounding valleys, the silhouette of the Dragoons on the horizon was a constant reminder of the danger that could descend at any moment. 2 days later, Eleanor Blackwood appeared at the territorial office in Silver Creek with an unusual request. According to the clerk's records, she inquired about the legal status of redeemed captives, individuals purchased from hostile Indians. The clerk, one Thomas Barrow, informed her that while the practice of ransoming captives was not unheard of, especially along the Mexican border, it existed in a legal gray area that the territorial government preferred not to officially acknowledge. Barrow would later testify that Mrs. Blackwood's interest seemed academic rather than practical. She asked detailed questions about documentation requirements, price ranges, and whether the territorial government offered reimbursement for such transactions. He thought little of it at the time, attributing her curiosity to Eastern fascination with frontier customs. The practice of trading captives had a long and complex history in the borderlands. For centuries, Apache bands had taken captives during raids, sometimes incorporating them into their tribes and sometimes trading them to other groups. The Spanish, Mexican, and later American authorities had often negotiated for the return of captives, creating a system of exchange that persisted even as official policies condemned it. By the 1880s, a shadow economy existed along the border, with various intermediaries facilitating these transactions for profit. 1 week later, on August 10th, a Mexican trader named Miguel Vasquez arrived at Mrs. Blackwood's property, leading a small boy of approximately 7 years of age. The boy, gaunt and dressed in rags, was clearly of Apache origin. According to Vasquez's subsequent testimony, he had purchased the child from a band of Chiricahua Apache in exchange for rifles and ammunition, a common, if illegal, trade along the border. His intention had been to sell the boy to a ranching family near Tucson who had lost children in a previous raid, a practice he described as reconciliation through exchange. Instead, he found himself at Eleanor Blackwood's door, drawn there by rumors that the Eastern woman had expressed interest in acquiring captives. What happened next was witnessed by Jose Martinez, who had accompanied Vasquez as a guide and interpreter. According to Martinez's sworn statement dated April 18, 1882, Mrs. Blackwood emerged from her house at their approach, observed the Apache boy for several long moments without speaking, then uttered the words that would later become infamous throughout the territory, "Don't hurt him, I'll buy him." The transaction was completed quickly. $60 in gold changed hands, an exorbitant sum for the period, and Vasquez departed with his payment, leaving the Apache child in Mrs. Blackwood's custody. Martinez, troubled by something in the woman's demeanor, lingered behind. He observed Mrs. Blackwood lead the child into her house, one hand resting on his shoulder, with what he described as a grip more suited to property than a person. The boy did not struggle, Martinez later testified. He had the look of one who has seen too much, empty eyes like the prisoners I saw during the war. The senora spoke to him gently enough, but there was something in her voice that made my skin crawl. She told him he would be safe now, that she would take care of him. But the way she looked at him, it was not the look of a woman who had found a child to nurture. It was the look of a cook who has found the perfect ingredient. Disturbed but unsure of what to do, Martinez returned to Tucson with Vasquez. He did not report what he had seen to the authorities, later explaining that such transactions, while distasteful, were not uncommon along the border. Who was he to question the motives of an American lady? It was the last time the boy was seen alive by anyone outside the Blackwood Ranch. Over the next 3 months, Eleanor Blackwood's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She made fewer trips to town, and when she did appear, witnesses noted significant changes in her appearance and manner. The postmaster, Edwin Shaw, recorded in his personal journal that Mrs. B has transformed from a reserved widow to something altogether unsettling. She speaks rapidly, often to herself, and her once immaculate clothing now bears stains of unknown origin. Her eyes have a feverish quality that causes most townspeople to avoid her gaze. Shaw also noted that Mrs. Blackwood had begun ordering unusual items through the mail, specialized cutting tools, chemical preservatives, and several medical texts on human anatomy. As postmaster in a small frontier community, Shaw saw nothing wrong with noting the contents of packages that passed through his office, a common practice that served as an informal security measure in isolated settlements. In late September, Miguel Vasquez returned to Silver Creek with another captive, this time a young Apache woman of perhaps 16 years. Again he made his way to the Blackwood property. Again money changed hands, and again the captive disappeared behind the door of the isolated ranch house. Vasquez, who would later claim to have had no knowledge of Mrs. Blackwood's true intentions, continued to supply her with captives throughout the autumn of 1881. His connections with border traders and certain Apache bands provided him with a steady, if limited, supply of prisoners taken during raids. What he did know, and later admitted to investigators, was that Mrs. Blackwood paid more than any other buyer, sometimes twice the going rate for a captive, and asked no questions about their origin or condition. She only had one requirement, Vasquez testified. They had to be healthy, no wounds, no disease. She examined them like horses, checking their teeth, their eyes, the firmness of their flesh. Once she rejected a boy because he had a fever, said he wouldn't do for her purposes. By October, rumors had begun to circulate through Silver Creek regarding unusual activities at the Blackwood property. Hunters reported hearing strange cries at night. A cowhand named William Parker, who had become lost while tracking stray cattle, claimed to have observed Mrs. Blackwood digging in the dry wash behind her house well after midnight, the scene illuminated only by a lantern placed on a nearby rock. She was digging like a person possessed, Parker told the county sheriff. I watched for maybe 20 minutes from the ridge above. The hole was already deep when I got there, and she kept at it without rest. Then she dragged something wrapped in canvas from the house and pushed it into the hole. I couldn't see clearly what it was, but it was about the size of a child. I left before she finished. Didn't want her to spot me. Something about the whole scene made my blood run cold. Most disturbing were the reports from Joshua Collins, who delivered mail to the outlying properties twice weekly. Collins stated that on 3 separate occasions he detected a powerful stench like that of a slaughterhouse in summer, emanating from the Blackwood property. When he inquired about the smell, Mrs. Blackwood informed him that she had begun curing meats for the winter months. She invited me to stay for supper, Collins later testified. Something in her manner made my skin crawl. I made my excuses and left, though she called after me that I was missing the finest stew in the territory. The autumn of 1881 was marked by increased Apache activity throughout the region. In August, the Army had attempted to arrest the medicine man, Noc-I del Clina, resulting in the Battle of Sibique Creek, where the shaman was killed. This sparked an uprising that included an attack on Fort Apache and further raids on settlements. The famous warrior Geronimo, who had been living on the San Carlos Reservation, fled with a band of followers, fearing arrest after the Sibique incident. For the next 5 years, he would lead the last significant Apache resistance against American forces. This increased tension created a climate of fear that may have delayed a more thorough investigation of the strange occurrences at the Blackwood Ranch. With military resources stretched thin and local law enforcement focused on protecting settlements from raids, the odd behavior of a solitary widow was not a priority, regardless of how unsettling it might be. By November, Eleanor Blackwood had purchased 4 more Apache captives, 2 children, and 2 adults, all acquired through Miguel Vasquez or other traders operating along the Mexican border. Each transaction was conducted privately, with no paperwork filed at the territorial office. Each captive entered the Blackwood property and was never seen leaving it. During this period, Mrs. Blackwood's appearance continued to deteriorate. Witnesses described her as increasingly gaunt, with deep shadows under her eyes and an unnatural pallor to her skin. Her once elegant clothing became disheveled, and those who spoke with her noted that her conversation frequently diverged into rambling monologues about the nature of savagery and the consumption of strength. Sarah Miller, wife of the local banker, encountered Mrs. Blackwood at the general store in early November and later described the meeting as chilling beyond words. She was purchasing salt, large quantities of it, Mrs. Miller recalled. When I commented on the amount, she looked at me with those strange, feverish eyes and said, "Preservation requires sacrifice, my dear. First the body, then the soul." I had no idea what she meant, but the way she said it made me hurry home and lock my doors. It was not until December 7, 1881, that the territorial authorities began to take notice of the situation. On that date, Eleanor Blackwood hosted what she called a frontier dinner for several prominent citizens of Silver Creek, including the mayor, the bank manager, and the owner of the largest mining operation in the area. The invitation, written in elegant script on fine stationery, promised a unique culinary experience featuring local ingredients prepared in the traditional manner. The mining boom that had created towns like Silver Creek brought with it attempts to establish civilized society in the wilderness. Cultural events, dinner parties, and other social gatherings were important markers of status and community cohesion. For the town's elite, an invitation to dine at a private home, even one as isolated and unusual as the Blackwood Ranch, represented an obligation that could not easily be declined without causing offense. 3 of the 5 invited guests attended. None would ever forget what followed. According to sworn statements provided by all 3 men, the evening began normally enough. Mrs. Blackwood's home was meticulously clean, decorated with expensive furnishings that seemed out of place in the frontier setting. She served wine imported from California and engaged her guests in pleasant conversation about territorial politics and mining prospects. The dinner started with a soup that one guest described as unusual but not unpleasant, followed by a salad of desert plants that Mrs. Blackwood claimed to have gathered herself. Throughout the meal she became increasingly animated, describing her interest in native customs and her belief that by partaking of the enemy's essence, one might absorb their strength. It was the main course that transformed the evening from a social obligation into a nightmare. Mrs. Blackwood presented a large tureen of stew, which she ladled into porcelain bowls with evident pride. "Gentlemen," she reportedly announced, "you are about to taste something few white men have experienced. This is a traditional Apache recipe, prepared with ingredients that were, until recently, preparing to murder us in our sleep." The men, believing she was referring to game hunted in Apache territory, began to eat. Mayor Frederick Harrison would later describe the meat as unusually tender, with a sweetness unlike any venison or beef I had encountered. It was only when Mrs. Blackwood began to describe her ingredients in greater detail that the true nature of the meal became horrifyingly clear. She spoke of her captives as if they were livestock, bank manager Philip Townsend testified. She explained how she selected them based on age and health, how she kept them in her root cellar until they were ready for preparation. When I realized what she was implying, what she had fed us, I became violently ill. According to the testimony of James Wilson, owner of the Silver Pick mine, Mrs. Blackwood's description became increasingly graphic and disturbing as the evening progressed. She detailed her methods of preparation, the differences in texture between young and mature specimens, and her experiments with various preservation techniques. She was absolutely convinced that by consuming Apache flesh, she was absorbing their strength and resilience, Wilson stated. She cited obscure anthropological texts and frontier accounts of cannibalistic practices among certain tribes. But what was most disturbing was her complete detachment, as if she were discussing a new method of ore extraction rather than the systematic murder and consumption of human beings. The dinner party dissolved into chaos. Mayor Harrison vomited on the dining table. Townsend attempted to restrain Mrs. Blackwood, who reacted with surprise rather than resistance. Wilson fled the house to summon help, only to be pursued by their hostess, who called after him that he was rejecting the gift of power she had offered. Mayor Harrison summoned the territorial marshal the following morning, and a search party was dispatched to the Blackwood property. Eleanor Blackwood offered no resistance when they arrived. She welcomed them into her home and offered them refreshments, which they declined. She seemed genuinely puzzled by our disgust, Marshal Robert Emmett wrote in his official report, as if she had committed no crime but merely violated some minor social convention. She spoke freely about her activities, offering to show us her methods as if demonstrating a new cooking technique. It was the most disturbing display of madness I have encountered in 20 years of law enforcement. The evidence they discovered was damning. In the root cellar, they found 3 Apache captives, 2 children, and an elderly woman, chained to the wall and severely malnourished. In an outbuilding behind the main house, they discovered cooking implements and butchering tools, still stained with what would later be confirmed as human blood. Behind the house, in the dry wash where William Parker had observed Mrs. Blackwood digging, they unearthed partial remains of at least 7 individuals. Most disturbing of all was the journal they found in Mrs. Blackwood's writing desk, in which she had meticulously documented her activities since arriving in Arizona Territory. The journal, preserved now in the Tucson Historical Archives, reveals a mind descending rapidly into madness, a journey that began long before her arrival in Silver Creek. The earliest entries, dated January 1881, referenced the death of her husband in Philadelphia and her decision to seek redemption in the savage lands where my Edward met his end. Subsequent passages revealed that Edward Blackwood had been an Army officer killed during an Apache attack in 1879, his body reportedly mutilated in a manner that haunted his widow's dreams. They took his heart, she wrote on February 3, 1881. The surgeon who examined him said they took his heart, perhaps to consume it, to take his courage for themselves. If such is their belief, then perhaps there is wisdom in it that our civilized minds have forgotten. Perhaps in consuming the enemy, one might gain mastery over them. The journal chronicled her growing obsession with accounts of cannibalism, both among indigenous peoples and in European history. She collected and transcribed stories of the Donner Party, of shipwrecked sailors driven to consume their comrades, of ancient warriors who ate the hearts of their enemies to absorb their strength. Civilization is merely a veneer, she wrote on April 17, 1881. Beneath it lies the truth of our nature, that we are consumers, that strength comes from consumption, that to truly defeat an enemy, one must consume them utterly. The later entries detailed her experiments with the Apache captives she had purchased. She recorded their ages, physical condition, and how long they survived in her cellar before being processed. She described her methods of preparation in clinical detail, noting the differences in taste and texture based on the age and gender of her victims. Most disturbing were her observations on the efficacy of her practice. "I feel stronger with each meal," she wrote on October 30, 1881. "My vision is sharper, my thoughts clearer. I can feel their essence within me, their wildness and their freedom. Soon I shall have consumed enough to become invulnerable to their kind. When I have taken enough of them into myself, I shall be immune to their savagery, for I shall possess it all." Eleanor Blackwood's response to this trauma was not merely to seek revenge, but to convince herself that by consuming her enemies, she could achieve some perverse form of justice. "They devoured my happiness," she wrote on September 12, 1881. "Now I shall devour them in turn, and in so doing, become strong enough to destroy them all. The Territorial Court convened a special session to address the Blackwood case on January 15, 1882. The proceedings were closed to the public due to the exceptionally disturbing nature of the crimes. Eleanor Blackwood, now referred to in local newspapers as the Cannibal Widow or simply the Monster of Silver Creek, represented herself at trial. She offered no defense beyond stating that one cannot murder an animal and savages are nothing more. Throughout the trial, Mrs. Blackwood maintained a demeanor that witnesses described as eerily composed. She objected to legal points with precision, cited precedents regarding the treatment of hostile Indians, and repeatedly referred to her victims as specimens rather than people. When confronted with the testimony of the surviving captives, she showed no remorse or recognition of their humanity. She spoke of them as if they were not present in the courtroom, court reporter Samuel Jennings noted. When the young boy described his captivity and the fate of his companions, she appeared to be taking notes on his testimony rather than listening to the human suffering he described. The jury deliberated for less than 1 hour before returning a guilty verdict. Judge Harmon Thornton, visibly shaken by the evidence presented, sentenced Eleanor Blackwood to death by hanging, an unusual punishment for a woman in that era, but one that reflected the exceptional nature of her crimes. In delivering the sentence, Judge Thornton addressed the defendant directly. "Mrs. Blackwood, you have committed acts of such depravity that they strain the very fabric of human understanding. You have sought to clothe murder in the garments of scientific inquiry, to disguise butchery as cultural exchange. But this court sees through these pretensions to the monstrous truth beneath. You have not only taken innocent lives, but have desecrated the dead in a manner that offends all principles of decency and humanity. The Territory of Arizona hereby sentences you to be hanged by the neck until dead, and may God have mercy on your soul." The execution was scheduled for March 22, 1882. Eleanor Blackwood spent her final weeks in a specially constructed cell in the Silver Creek jailhouse, under constant guard to prevent suicide or escape. Visitors reported that she remained eerily composed, spending her days writing in a new journal that the authorities confiscated and destroyed after her death. Dr. William Fletcher, the territorial physician who examined Mrs. Blackwood during her incarceration, later wrote a monograph on the case for the American Journal of Psychiatry. In it, he described her as a unique specimen of criminal insanity, noting that she displayed none of the usual characteristics of the hysterical female criminal that dominated medical thinking of the time. Mrs. Blackwood exhibited a form of monomania centered on the consumption of enemy flesh as a means of absorbing strength, Dr. Fletcher wrote. What makes her case particularly unusual is the intellectual framework she constructed around her delusion. She did not act from simple bloodlust or revenge, but from a carefully considered, if utterly mad, philosophy regarding the transfer of power through consumption. Her ability to maintain normal social functioning in most areas of life while harboring such extreme deviance in others suggests a compartmentalization of psychopathology that merits further study. On the morning of her execution, Eleanor Blackwood requested and was granted permission to make a final statement. Standing on the gallows before a small crowd of official witnesses, she spoke words that would be recorded by the court stenographer and later sealed by judicial order. "What I have done in the name of civilization. The Apache consumed the flesh of their enemies to absorb their strength. I merely adopted their custom to turn it against them. If I am a monster, then I am a monster of your making, forged in the fire of frontier justice and tempered by grief. Remember me not as a criminal, but as a pioneer. Others will follow where I have led, and the savage races will vanish from this earth, consumed by the very civilization they sought to destroy." Her final words contained a terrible irony that few present fully appreciated. The practice of cannibalism that she attributed to the Apache was largely a myth, a product of frontier propaganda rather than actual tribal custom. Like many settlers, Eleanor Blackwood had projected her own darkest impulses onto the people she feared, then used that projection to justify acting on those same impulses. Eleanor Blackwood was pronounced dead at 11:17 a.m. on March 22, 1882. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave outside the Silver Creek Cemetery, the location known only to the marshal and the gravedigger. The case might have faded into obscurity, remembered only as a macabre footnote in territorial history, had it not been for the discovery made by historian Margaret Wheeler in 1957. While researching frontier justice for her doctoral dissertation, Wheeler uncovered court records indicating that Eleanor Blackwood's crimes were not isolated incidents. Between 1879 and 1883, at least 3 other cases were documented in Arizona territory involving the purchase and subsequent murder of Apache captives. None reached the scale or depravity of the Blackwood case, but all followed a similar pattern. Individuals traumatized by Apache violence sought revenge through acts that mirrored the very savagery they claimed to abhor. Wheeler's research revealed a disturbing undercurrent in frontier society that official histories had largely ignored. The Indian problem, as it was commonly called, had created a moral vacuum in which certain settlers felt justified in committing atrocities that would have been unthinkable in more established communities. The remote nature of homesteads like the Blackwood Ranch, combined with the general antipathy toward Apache people, created conditions where extreme acts could go unnoticed or unreported for extended periods. More disturbing still were Wheeler's findings regarding the fate of the surviving captives rescued from the Blackwood property. Rather than being returned to their people, the 3 Apache survivors were transferred to a reservation school in Colorado, where their names were changed and their origins obscured. School records indicate that the eldest, the woman identified only as Jane Doe No. 3 in court documents, repeatedly attempted to tell her story, but was dismissed as delusional by school administrators. The irony is palpable, Wheeler wrote in her 1959 book, Frontier Justice and Frontier Crimes. The survivors of a horrific ordeal in which they were treated as less than human were subsequently processed by a system that, while less overtly violent, still refused to recognize their full humanity or the validity of their experience. In 1891, 9 years after the Blackwood execution, a frontier newspaper called the Arizona Star published an interview with Miguel Vasquez, the trader, who had supplied Eleanor Blackwood with her victims. Dying of tuberculosis in a Tucson hospital, Vasquez claimed that Mrs. Blackwood had not acted alone. He alleged that several prominent citizens of Silver Creek had participated in her frontier dinners on multiple occasions, fully aware of what they were consuming. They called it taming the savage, Vasquez was quoted as saying. They believed that by eating Apache flesh, they were conquering the spirit of the people. The widow was merely their butcher, the one willing to dirty her hands while they kept theirs clean. The newspaper was forced to retract the story after threats of legal action from several unnamed parties. The editor was found dead 3 weeks later, an apparent suicide, though no note was ever discovered. Wheeler's investigation into these claims proved inconclusive. The men who had attended the fateful dinner on December 7, 1881, Mayor Harrison, banker Townsend, and mine owner Wilson, had all left the territory by 1885. Harrison and Wilson died before Wheeler could locate them. Townsend, located in a San Francisco boarding house in 1958, refused to discuss the case beyond confirming that he had testified at the trial. Some doors should remain closed, he reportedly told Wheeler. Some memories are best left buried in the desert where they belong. In 1968, during construction of a highway near the former site of Silver Creek, workers uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 22 individuals of Native American origin. Forensic examination indicated that many bore evidence of butchery consistent with the preparation of human flesh for consumption. The remains were quietly reburied, and the discovery was not widely reported. The site foreman, David Reynolds, later told a local historian that the graves showed signs of having been disturbed and rearranged at some point after the initial burials. "It looked like someone had tried to hide the evidence," Reynolds said, "like they'd dug up the original graves and reburied everything deeper and more scattered, like someone knew what was there and wanted to make sure it stayed hidden." This discovery lent credence to Vasquez's claim that Mrs. Blackwood's activities had been more extensive than officially acknowledged, and possibly supported by others in the community. However, with most of the principals long dead and documentary evidence scarce, the full truth of the matter remains elusive. Today, the land where Eleanor Blackwood's ranch house once stood is private property, fenced off and posted against trespassers. Local residents avoid the area, claiming that the ground is tainted and that strange sounds can be heard there on still nights. Not the voices of supernatural entities, but something more disturbing, the echoes of a historical atrocity that society has chosen to forget. The story of Eleanor Blackwood serves as a stark reminder that the frontier was not merely a place of geographical boundaries, but of moral ones as well. In the vast, unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory, some individuals found themselves crossing lines they would never have approached in more civilized surroundings. The isolation, the fear, and the constant tension of life on the edge of Apache territory created a perfect storm of conditions in which the darkest aspects of human nature could flourish. The silver mines that gave birth to towns like Silver Creek represented both the promise and the peril of the frontier. They drew thousands of people from all walks of life into close proximity with cultures they didn't understand and landscapes they couldn't tame. The rush for mineral wealth created boomtowns where social norms were fluid and justice was often improvised. In this environment, the line between predator and prey, between civilized and savage, could blur beyond recognition. Perhaps most troubling is the knowledge that Eleanor Blackwood was neither the first nor the last to view her Apache neighbors not as human beings, but as something less, as obstacles to be removed, as enemies to be destroyed, or, in her particular madness, as sustenance to be consumed. Her crimes, exceptional though they were in their depravity, existed on a spectrum of dehumanization that characterized much of the frontier experience. The Apache Wars that provided the backdrop for the Blackwood case had begun decades earlier, fueled by misunderstandings, broken treaties, and violence on both sides. The discovery of silver in places like the Santa Rita Mountains in the 1850s had intensified conflicts as miners and prospectors pushed into Apache territory. Each raid and counter-raid deepened the cycle of revenge, creating wounds that would not easily heal. By 1881, the warfare had become deeply personal for many on both sides, with atrocities committed that would haunt survivors for generations. What set Eleanor Blackwood apart was not her hatred of the Apache. Such sentiment was common among settlers who had lost loved ones to raids, but the methodical way she expressed that hatred and the elaborate justification she constructed around her actions. Where others might have sought revenge through violence, she sought it through consumption, convincing herself that in devouring her enemy, she was claiming their power. In 1965, the last known survivor with direct knowledge of the Blackwood case passed away in Tucson. Mary Collins, who had been a young girl in Silver Creek during the events of 1881 and 1882, gave a final interview to the University of Arizona Historical Society just months before her death. When asked what she remembered most clearly about Eleanor Blackwood, Collins paused for a long moment before responding, "It wasn't her crimes that frightened us most, though God knows they were terrible enough. It was the way the town changed after she was gone. People stopped talking about it, but they didn't stop thinking about it. Something had been revealed that couldn't be unseen, not about the Apache, but about ourselves, about what we were capable of becoming out there, so far from the restraints of civilization. Eleanor Blackwood may have been hanged, but the darkness she represented didn't die with her. It just went quiet, hiding in the shadow of progress, waiting for another opportunity to emerge." The territorial records regarding the Blackwood case were sealed by judicial order in 1885 and remained so until 1957. Even now, certain documents related to the investigation are restricted, ostensibly to protect the identities of the victims, but perhaps also to shield the reputations of prominent families whose ancestors may have been implicated in the wider scandal. What cannot be hidden is the legacy of fear and suspicion that the case left behind, a persistent whisper that sometimes, in the struggle to tame a hostile frontier, the line between civilization and savagery could become dangerously thin. Eleanor Blackwood crossed that line deliberately, but how many others approached it? How many stood at the edge, looking into the abyss of what they might become if they took just one step further? The months following the Blackwood trial saw significant changes in Silver Creek. Several prominent citizens left the territory suddenly, citing business opportunities elsewhere or health concerns that required treatment in California. The mining operation that had been the town's lifeblood began to falter, not from lack of silver, but from difficulty attracting new workers and investment. By 1885, production had declined significantly. By 1893, the mines had closed completely. Some locals attributed the town's decline to simple economics. The price of silver had begun to fall, and richer strikes elsewhere had drawn attention away from Silver Creek. Others, however, spoke of a curse, a darkness that had settled over the community after the Blackwood revelations. They claimed that the land itself had been poisoned, not by any supernatural force, but by the knowledge of what had happened there, a psychic stain that could not be removed. People just couldn't look each other in the eye anymore. Joseph Farrell, a Silver Creek miner, told an interviewer in 1901, "Every time you sat down to dinner with neighbors, you'd catch yourself wondering, did they know? Were they part of it? There was no trust left. And without trust, a mining town can't function. We rely on each other too much for that." The Apache Wars officially ended in 1886 with the surrender of Geronimo. The Apache people were removed to reservations, their territory divided and distributed to miners, ranchers, and settlers. Silver Creek faded away when the mines were exhausted, its buildings dismantled for lumber, its stories gradually absorbed into the broader narrative of westward expansion. But in certain archives, in yellowed newspaper clippings and crumbling court documents, the story of Eleanor Blackwood remains. A dark chapter in a history already written in blood, a reminder that sometimes the most monstrous appetites wear the most civilized faces. The fate of the captives who survived their ordeal at the Blackwood Ranch represents another tragic aspect of this case. The 3 survivors, 2 children and 1 elderly woman, were not returned to their people, but were instead processed through the Indian Bureau system. Records indicate that the children were sent to boarding schools designed to civilize Native American youth by stripping them of their culture, language, and identity. The elderly woman, whose name was recorded only as Jane Doe at Birth 3, was sent to the Colorado River Reservation, where she died in 1888. A journal kept by a teacher at the Grand Junction Indian School contains a brief reference to one of the children, now renamed Thomas Williams, who was said to wake screaming in the night, claiming that the white woman is cooking my brother. The teacher noted that such savage fantasies were common among newly arrived Apache children and would fade with proper Christian education and discipline. The authorities' failure to recognize the trauma these survivors had experienced or to acknowledge the legitimacy of their accounts represents a secondary victimization that was all too common in the treatment of Native Americans during this period. Their stories were dismissed as superstition or exaggeration, their suffering minimized or ignored in the name of progress and civilization. In 1957, when Margaret Wheeler began her investigation into the Blackwood case, she attempted to locate descendants of the survivors. Her search led her to a Mescalero Apache reservation in New Mexico, where she found the granddaughter of Thomas Williams, now an elderly woman herself. According to Wheeler's notes, the woman remembered her grandfather as a man haunted by nightmares, who refused to eat meat and who warned children never to trust white strangers, especially women who lived alone. He would never speak directly of what happened to him, the woman told Wheeler. But sometimes, when he thought no one was listening, he would talk to the spirits of those who didn't survive. He would promise them that he remembered, that someone knew the truth of how they died. That was important to him, that someone remembered. And somewhere in the Arizona desert, in an unmarked grave whose location has long since been forgotten, lie the remains of a Philadelphia widow who traveled west seeking revenge and found instead a darkness within herself that matched anything she encountered on the frontier. Her story echoes still, a warning from the past about the fragility of the moral boundaries we take for granted, and how easily they can be crossed when hatred and fear take root in the human heart. Historical accounts of the Blackwood case often focus exclusively on Eleanor herself, portraying her as an aberration, a solitary monster whose actions reflected nothing but her own madness. This framing is comforting but incomplete. The broader context of her crimes, the captive trade that supplied her victims, the community that failed to notice their disappearance, the authorities who dismissed early warnings, suggests a more complicated truth, that her madness flourished because it grew in fertile soil. The captive trade that brought Apache prisoners to Eleanor Blackwood's door was an established, if shadowy, institution along the border. Miguel Vasquez was not a rogue operator, but one of many middlemen who facilitated the exchange of human beings for profit. While some captives were ransomed back to their families or adopted into settler households, others disappeared into a system of exploitation that has been largely erased from official histories. Documents uncovered by later researchers suggest that between 1860 and 1886, as many as 500 Apache captives, primarily women and children, were sold into what amounted to slavery in northern Mexico, where they worked in mines, on ranches, or in households. Others were transported to the interior of Mexico or to Cuba. The territorial authorities were aware of this trade, but made only token efforts to stop it, viewing it as a regrettable but unavoidable feature of frontier life. The territorial attorney who prosecuted the Blackwood case, James Harrington, later wrote in his private correspondence that the case had forced him to confront the darker aspects of our settlement of this land. In a letter to his brother in Boston, dated April 1882, he confessed, "I cannot escape the uncomfortable realization that while Mrs. Blackwood's actions were exceptional in their depravity, they were made possible by a system in which we all participate, one that treats the Apache as commodities rather than people. We prosecute her for the manner in which she disposed of her property, not for the fact that she believed she could own another human being in the first place." This moral ambiguity extended to the response of the Silver Creek community as a whole. While the men who attended the fateful dinner reacted with appropriate horror when they realized what they had consumed, records suggest that many in the town had harbored suspicions about Mrs. Blackwood's activities long before that night. The strange sounds reported by hunters, the disturbing odors noted by the mailman, the midnight digging observed by the cowhand, all of these warning signs had been noticed, but not acted upon. Martha Holloway, the storekeeper's wife who had found Mrs. Blackwood's interest in butchering techniques unusual, later admitted to investigators that she had suspected something wasn't right out at that ranch. When asked why she hadn't reported her concerns, she replied simply, "They were just Apaches. Nobody much cared what happened to them, long as they weren't raiding any more." This callous indifference reflected the dehumanization that had become normalized during decades of conflict. The Apache were viewed not as a people defending their homeland, but as obstacles to progress, as inherently savage and therefore deserving of whatever fate befell them. This perspective, shared by many settlers and enshrined in territorial policies, created an environment where atrocities could occur with minimal consequence. When Geronimo surrendered in 1886, officially ending the Apache Wars, one chapter of southwestern history closed and another began. The mining towns that had sprung up during the silver boom began to transition to more sustainable economies, or, like Silver Creek, faded into ghost towns. The Apache people, once feared as the most formidable warriors of the Southwest, were confined to reservations where poverty and despair replaced the freedom they had fought so hard to preserve. The next time you drive through the vast empty spaces of the American Southwest, where the horizon stretches unbroken for miles, and the only sound is the wind moving through the sage, remember that these landscapes hold secrets. Some have been deliberately buried, others simply forgotten as those who knew them passed away. But the land remembers, and sometimes, if you listen carefully enough, it still speaks of those who came before, both those who built civilization in the wilderness and those who revealed how quickly civilization can crumble when faced with the wilderness within. In 1972, archaeologist Robert Sanderson conducted a survey of the area where the Blackwood Ranch had once stood. His team excavated the foundations of the main house and several outbuildings, hoping to find artifacts that might shed light on daily life in a frontier household. What they discovered instead were bone fragments, human bone fragments, scattered throughout the soil around the property. The distribution pattern suggests that the remains were not confined to formal burial sites, Sanderson wrote in his field notes. Rather, they appear to have been disposed of casually across the property over time, as if the entire area had been treated as a dumping ground. The implication is disturbing. The scale of killing may have been considerably larger than the official record indicates. Carbon dating of the bone fragments suggested that they dated from the period of Blackwood's residence, approximately 1881-1882. Microscopic examination revealed cut marks consistent with butchery, confirming the nature of the activities that had taken place there. Most disturbing was the discovery that many of the fragments came from children, some as young as 3 or 4 years old. Sanderson's findings were documented in a brief academic paper published in the Journal of Southwestern Archaeology, but they received little attention outside of specialist circles. The paper was titled Evidence of Systematic Cannibalism at a Frontier Homestead, 1881-1882, and it concluded with a somber reflection on the ethical responsibilities of archaeological research. In uncovering these remains, we have disturbed the final resting place of individuals who suffered greatly in life. Their bodies were treated as commodities in death, just as they themselves had been treated as commodities in the captive trade that brought them to this place. As researchers, we must ask ourselves, are we continuing this commodification by turning their tragedy into academic currency? Or can our work serve as a form of belated recognition, an acknowledgement that what happened here was not just a frontier crime, but a human catastrophe that deserves to be remembered? The remains discovered by Sanderson's team were repatriated to the San Carlos Apache Reservation in 1975, where they were reburied with appropriate ceremonies. No marker identifies the grave, but tribal elders maintained its location as part of an oral tradition that preserves the memory of those lost during the turbulent years of the Apache Wars. In 1988, novelist Catherine Walker published The Hunger, a fictionalized account of the Blackwood case that became a bestseller and was later adapted into a film. While the book was marketed as a historical thriller, Walker took significant liberties with the facts, portraying Eleanor Blackwood as a victim of possession by an ancient spirit that had driven other settlers to similar acts throughout the Southwest. The San Carlos Apache Tribal Council issued a formal protest against the book and film, arguing that they sensationalized a genuine tragedy and perpetuated harmful stereotypes about Apache spiritual practices. In their statement, the council noted, "Our people were the victims in this historical event, not the perpetrators of evil. To suggest otherwise is to continue the dehumanization that made such atrocities possible in the first place." Walker defended her work as fiction inspired by history rather than a factual account, but the controversy highlighted the ongoing sensitivity surrounding the Blackwood case and the broader issues of how frontier history is remembered and represented. The debate it sparked led to increased collaboration between historians and tribal communities in documenting the events of the Apache Wars, with a focus on incorporating Apache perspectives that had previously been marginalized or ignored. In 2010, a collection of letters written by Eleanor Blackwood before her journey to Arizona was discovered in the archives of the Philadelphia Historical Society. The letters, addressed to her sister in Boston, reveal a woman already struggling with grief and mental instability following her husband's death. In one letter, dated December 12, 1880, she wrote, "I dream of Edward every night, but he is not as he was in life. In my dreams he is hollow-eyed and accusing. He tells me that I must find those who took his heart and take theirs in return. The doctors say these are merely manifestations of my grief, that with time they will fade, but they grow stronger, not weaker. Last night I dreamed I was consuming a human heart, raw and still beating. I woke with the taste of blood in my mouth and the terrible knowledge that I had found it sweet." These letters suggest that the seeds of Blackwood's madness were planted before she ever set foot in Arizona territory. The frontier, with its isolation and lawlessness, did not create her obsession, but provided the conditions in which it could be expressed without immediate consequence. The Apache became the focus of her delusion, not because of who they were, but because of what they represented in the narrative she had constructed around her husband's death. This psychological dimension adds another layer to an already complex case. Eleanor Blackwood was clearly suffering from what modern psychiatry would diagnose as severe mental illness, possibly schizophrenia or delusional disorder, yet her actions unfolded within a societal context that enabled them, a frontier society that devalued Apache lives, a captive trade that treated human beings as commodities, a community that noticed warning signs but failed to act upon them. The story of Eleanor Blackwood and her victims is thus not merely a tale of individual madness, but a lens through which we can examine the darker aspects of the American frontier experience. It reminds us that behind the mythology of rugged individualism and manifest destiny lay human beings capable of both remarkable courage and appalling cruelty, sometimes within the same heart. Today, the land where Silver Creek once stood has been reclaimed by the desert. Sagebrush and mesquite grow where mining operations once extracted silver from the reluctant earth. The town's cemetery, with its weathered markers bearing the names of miners, merchants, and their families, is maintained by a historical preservation society. But most visitors pass it by without stopping, hurrying along the highway toward more famous destinations. No marker commemorates the unmarked grave where Eleanor Blackwood was buried. No monument stands for the Apache captives who died at her hands. Their stories survive only in archived documents, academic papers, and the oral traditions of the Apache people who still carry the memory of those lost during the violent years of territorial expansion. In the end, perhaps that is as it should be. Some horrors are best remembered quietly, their lessons absorbed without celebration or sensationalism. The case of Eleanor Blackwood reminds us that the line between civilization and savagery has never been as clear as we might wish to believe, that it runs not between cultures or peoples, but through the human heart itself, a warning from history that bears remembering in every age. As the sun sets over the Dragoon Mountains, casting long shadows across the land where these events unfolded nearly a century and a half ago, we are left with questions rather than answers, with unease rather than resolution. That, too, is appropriate. Some stories don't offer the comfort of clear moral lessons or satisfying conclusions. They simply bear witness to what was, and in doing so, challenge us to confront what might be. The capacity for darkness that exists alongside our highest aspirations, waiting for the conditions that might allow it to emerge once more. The wind moves through the sage, whispering secrets that most will never hear. But for those who listen closely, the story of Eleanor Blackwood and her victims continues to echo across the desert, a reminder that the most enduring hauntings are not supernatural, but historical, the unquiet ghosts of deeds we would prefer to forget but must remember if we hope to learn from them.